Hi everyone, this is Peter, and I'm going to record the second in a series of short videos on Surrealism, this important 20th century art movement. Very much, I think, alive and well today in various respects. And in a lot of ways, I think a follow-up to Dadaism, except in this case, instead of merely going in a kind of pursuit of the irrational, that aspect of automatism, of simply generating art via random methods, often with an eye to critiquing the assumptions and principles of art making and art theory. Instead of doing that, Surrealism is interested in the realms of the subconscious, and particularly that of dreams, of hallucinations, often aided by the ingestion of drugs or alcohol. Basically, we looked a little bit last time at the work of Salvador Dali in his remarkable painting, The Persistence of Memory, where he delivers to the viewer an uncanny and surreal vision, really just straight up a vision. Surrealism as a kind of higher reality, I think, is a good way of looking at it. Artists have represented visions in the past, and particularly I'm thinking of the Baroque and to some degree Renaissance art, but especially Reformation art, that attempted to present to the viewer fantastic visions. Probably one of the most spectacular, maybe not Reformation art, but one of the most spectacular examples being Hieronymus Bosch. This aspect of surrealism, sometimes described as naturalistic surrealism, that is, in a very real sense, evoking a dream. And the kind of thing we can see in movie theaters all the time today, especially thanks to computer-generated effects. That's an important aspect of surrealism, no question about that. But there are other ways of approaching the ideas of surrealism, and one of the most important artists and one of the more interesting ones is the Belgian painter Rene Magritte. If we look at Rene Magritte, his work as a whole, he seems to be preoccupied, and in a sense it's very Dada-esque, I suppose, but preoccupied with the conditions of perception and representation and understanding. And he does this in a relatively approachable fashion. I think, much like Dali, Magritte's a pretty popular artist. I don't think there's anything like the appeal, the lack of appeal, I'd argue, with somebody like Marcel Duchamp compared to Magritte. He definitely probes some interesting questions and does so in a relatively deceptive and disarming style. This particular image, which is, again, much like the Dali image, relatively small, but carries a lot of weight, conceptual weight, presents the viewer with a pretty simple, really nicely done. I mean, if you were a sign painter or a commercial artist, you'd have to admire this representation of a pipe here. The title of the work is translated in various ways: the treachery, treason of images. So right away, as you can see from the title, it doesn't really reference the subject matter per se. It really references the potential implications of the painting, and really, because it's so effective in terms of thinking about the painting, it really strikes at the heart of all kinds of representation, perhaps a universal critique of representation. Magritte wrote an essay, and this is kind of an interesting thing. We see, speaking of the relationship between image and text, we have the Surrealist Manifesto. And Magritte writes, and this is actually in conjunction with interesting developments in literary studies, linguistics, sociology, etc., on the lack of a clear and necessary relationship between, we'll just call them objects in the natural world. It could be pipes, horses, houses, whatever. Between phenomena in the natural world and their representation, whether in words or images. This is something that certainly in the 20th century is a really sort of cornerstone or bedrock concept for thinking seriously about culture and works of art, visual or literary. That there is always, when we talk, like I'm talking to you now, or when we read, like you can see the script in the Magritte image, there's a necessary disconnect, a kind of arbitrary, conventional aspect to representation that always puts up a roadblock to there being any genuine, best way of putting this is kind of factness to representation. Representation is not the thing that is being represented. And so the harder we try to make the meaning of words or works of art stick, the more obvious it is upon reflection that that necessity of meaning or a particular meaning, a specific intended meaning, that's not necessarily the case. In fact, it's not even not necessarily the case. It's really simply impossible to make it the case. So Magritte, in his Treachery or Treason of Images, lays it out for us very nicely with this, again, relatively benign and straightforward, again, from a commercial aspect, very effective representation of a pipe. Pipes are not as common, I suppose, today as they would have been at the time, 1928-29, when Magritte painted this. But I think it wouldn't be too hard to figure out for most human observers, even in 2019, or frankly any time since the invention of pipes, to understand what this is supposed to be showing. And then beneath it, in French, is the sentence, "Ceci n'est pas un pipe," which pretty literally translates, "This is not a pipe." Now, the first reaction to this could be a relatively simplistic one, which is to be baffled and to say, well, this is a pipe. And then the artist, I suppose, can come back with a kind of, snappy response. Well, of course it's not a pipe, right? It's a painting of a pipe. But you can also argue it's much more complicated even than that. Because what is a painting of a pipe? In fact, what would be kind of more interesting, and I'm trying to think if I've seen a version of this painting, which would basically make it even worse. This is not a painting of a pipe. As a, put that underneath it. I suppose you could put it under English, put it underneath the French and English, right? This is not even a painting of a pipe. Because what it is, and this is something that's going to turn up later in modern art, it's a piece of canvas with some color mixed with oil on it. What is a painting is a great question. It's not just that it's not a painting, not that this is not a pipe. It's like, what is a painting? And this kind of comes back a little bit to Marcel Duchamp's question that's being posed in his Fountain. Right? What is a sculpture? What is a painting? Does a painting even matter? And is the act of representation coherent in any meaningful sense? And the brilliance of the painting is just much like Salvador Dali. Its clarity, its specificity, its accuracy really seduces the viewer into wanting to say, now wait a second, this is certainly a pipe. No, it's not. It's not a painting. It's not a pipe. But it's also, upon deeper reflection, it's going to probe us to think, well, what is a painting? Right, what's it trying to do? For instance, the thing that Magritte has done to mess with us in terms of its being a painting of a pipe is to not have any location of this representation in any identifiable space. If the pipe's to scale, remember that the length of this is almost 2 feet, the height a little bit less than a foot. This is a huge pipe. This is not a pipe that makes any sense. So it's complicated. And if you think about this representation, this painting of the pipe, and start probing our own easy assumptions about the ways in which we handle words, sounds, visual imagery, we realize that without a whole lot of hard work, that we are simply handing around shadows, empty constructions, arbitrary and conventional signifiers that depend, and this is the sort of great movement of deconstructionism that occurs later in the 1950s and early 60s, that really depend upon their relation to other signifiers. There's no single truth that any given signifier conveys, other than, as in the case of this painting, I suppose, even though it's not really a painting, of a pipe, except in the sense that it's a piece of canvas with colors on it. So when you look at words, when you look at images, their truth claims only stand in relation, and this is the sort of central insight of deconstructionism, only stand in relation to other signifiers. You always have to have this relationship. And therefore, this sort of perches us, takes us away, I should say, from a kind of easy and relaxed and conventional exchange of ideas and images and writing, and instead perches us on the abyss of a kind of non-meaning, a hallucination. The whole thing, in other words, is a hallucination, a dream. And Magritte certainly, I think, much like Dali, is trying to kick us out of that everyday dream state and into a much more intense and possibly uncomfortable, perhaps a nightmare, maybe the treason, the treachery of images upon closer investigation propels us into a potentially dark and disconcerting nightmare. So it's worth spending some time thinking in depth about Magritte's achievement in art. He has many, many other fascinating pictures that typically feature the same kind of banal and, again, almost commercial style art, but with a little bit of deeper consideration and perception, reveal to us that the world of appearances, the world of images, the world, obviously, of art is much more complex, and that, unlike the saying goes that what you see is what you get, that in fact what we see is really has a marginal connection in the end with what we get.